Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Friday, May 23rd, 2025, and on Fridays we talk about human behavior and justifications. So in today's vlog, I'd like to consider an issue that's not often discussed when we talk about violence. And we make claims like, oh, they have such a violent society, or they have such a violent culture, or, men are violent, or teenagers are so violent, or sports are violent, and so on. Most important, what I hope to demonstrate is that there are actually different kinds of violence, and that the nature of violence varies, and sometimes quite dramatically, across social contexts. But of course, first we have to start with the definitional issue. So what do we mean by the term violence? Obviously, there are so many different approaches, and it's easy to just simply disagree right from the outset and say, well, we have different definitions, or we're disagreeing with each other because we're using different definitions of violence. So the point is we have to come up with some kind of an agreed upon or common definition in order to be able to study violence, and just to be clear that we're talking about the same thing. And there's always a political and a normative element to these discussions too, right? Such that someone might be interested in broader or narrower definitions depending upon their objectives, or perhaps even depending upon what they hope to argue. So as a social scientist, I have to say my bias has always been towards narrowing definitions. I like to work with narrower definitions of the phenomenon in question, mainly because I'm interested in the links between our theories, our explanations of human behavior, and the actual observable or empirical evidence that we're able to bring to bear. And I find that's easier to do. It's easier to evaluate the quality of our theories. The more narrow our definitions, the more precise we are, and of course, the more accurate our observations. So I hope we can all agree then that violence obviously can be defined in many different ways. There's no ultimately one right or wrong way as such, but my argument is just be clear in what you mean, right? And then I can understand you, you can understand me. You might have a different definition, that's fine. But at least for purposes of discussion or for purposes of the research, here's what we mean by violence. So in almost every definition that I've ever seen, though, regardless, violence usually has some reference to or some mention to physical harm at the very least. So in fact, it's usually physical violence that most people have in mind. In other words, the use of physical force to cause harm, destruction, or even death. And yet, of course, some people would argue that violence can assume other non-physical forms as well. We can talk about mental or psychological harm. We can talk about other types of harm. And some people would argue that that's what violence should include, those types of harm as well. And so in that sense, the concept of violence could actually imply a range not just of physical harm, but psychological, emotional, spiritual, and other types of harm. In fact, sometimes people will talk about inflicting emotional damage upon others, or we usually commonly use the term abuse as synonymous with violence. And so let me just clarify that. So I think what we can do, or to make our lives simpler, and again, to foster some agreement, is I like to think of abuse as being the broader category, if you will, which includes any and all types of harms that people might experience. So that, again, it could be physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, financial even, etc. And so to make the topic, again, more manageable when we talk about violence, I like to focus on the physical aspect. That is the threatened or actual use of physical force to cause harm. And so violence in that sense can be thought of as a subset of abuse. In other words, there are many different types of harm that can be inflicted upon a person or a group of people. And so in that sense, one can be abusive towards another person in many different ways, without necessarily being physically violent. But of course, one cannot be physically violent without also being abusive. So violence in that sense would be a subset of this broader category of abuse. And then I want to go further and argue that there's a great deal of physical abuse, obviously, that we see and observe all around us. But there's an even greater range, you might suggest, or I would suggest at least, in non-physical forms of abuse that people perpetrate. So even if you haven't been, for example, let's say you're an adult and you haven't been in a physical fight in many years, and I suspect most of you probably haven't. Some of you have. Please get help. But seriously, so you may have not had a physical fight, maybe even since you were a child, okay? But that doesn't mean you've never harmed someone else, or dare I say, even been abusive towards someone else, verbally or emotionally or psychologically. And of course, in some cases, we might not even be aware of the fact that we've harmed others. So I would argue then that we've all been guilty of harming or abusing someone or other people on occasion, and we ourselves have likely been abused, that is to say, harmed by others, often in non-physical forms, okay, throughout our lives to varying degrees. And by the way, if that never happened, if we weren't the perpetrators of abuse ourselves or didn't experience abuse ourselves, again, in some form or another, then we wouldn't have the need for, literally millions of therapists and counselors and psychiatrists and police officers and others involved in helping us to protect ourselves from one another. So, but today, again, for the remainder of the vlog, I just want to focus then on the violence as the threatened or actual use of physical force, typically against one's will, right? Which is quite similar to how the law defines violence as well. So even so, violence, I want to argue, assumes many different possible forms, okay? Even though when we speak about violence, we usually just use that singular, subject matter, that singular noun, violence. And then we apply that to all kinds of different things. So if you dive into your own mental filing cabinet, what do you find out? If you sort of flip through the different files and you come to the file labeled violence, and what do you see in there? Well, you probably have all kinds of different instances and images and examples that you've filed away in that mental filing cabinet that you've labeled violence, okay? And for that matter, many people have their own personal experiences of violence, however mild or however severe those situations or those experiences may have been. And since our experiences are by definition so personal and so often fraught with emotion, you can appreciate how and why people have very different ideas sometimes when they're talking about or thinking about and discussing violence, what they mean by violence. But again, I want to suggest too that there are fundamentally different kinds of violence, and these vary in accordance with the justifications that people offer for their own behaviors or for others' behaviors. So perhaps most surprising of all, most violence, and I mean literally if we're able to quantify it, I think most violence falls into a category that Donald Black, who was one of my key mentors in graduate school, refers to as moralistic violence. This essentially refers to the use of physical force or violence as a way in which people manage their conflicts with others. So you might say, well, you mean mismanage, because it's maybe not appropriate in your view to be managing conflicts with violence. That's fine. But here's the point. In his earlier work, Crime is Social Control, Black made a key argument that much violent crime is the result of people actually prosecuting grievances or responding with violence to the perceived affronts or threats or the wrongdoing of others. And so my colleagues in the field, Mark Cooney and Scott Phillips, write, for example, quote, that many crimes, especially crimes of violence, are moralistic reactions to behavior the assailant regards as deviant, be it a show of disrespect, an unpaid debt, a false accusation, an act of infidelity, a prior act of violence, or some other wrong. So that's what we mean by moralistic violence, or applying our own standards of morality or a form of moralism to use violence in a way of exercising social control or conflict management to deal with a situation when we're feeling aggrieved or we're feeling affronted or we're feeling that somebody else has done something wrong. And so we're responding with violence. So that's what we mean by moralistic violence. In contrast, there's predatory violence. This involves the pure exploitation of another person or their property for one's own personal ends. So predatory violence basically refers to this type of unilateral exchange whereby one uses violence specifically for instrumental purposes, purely for personal gain. No grievance involved. The classic example of predatory violence would be the conventional robbery or carjacking, right? Or you see somebody, a random person at an ATM, and you threaten them, say, give me your money. You don't necessarily, in fact, often you don't know the person involved in predatory violence. But the bottom line is you're just trying to exploit them. Often, as I say, a complete stranger, and they're targeted simply because of what they have. And it's kind of the classic example of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, for example, CTV recently reported pharmacy robberies have more than quintupled in some parts of Ontario as armed gangs have rushed in to fill the unmet need for opioids. And this, of course, terrifies healthcare professionals or, anybody who's working in the field there, that threat of robbery. And as I say, it's been especially intense in the Greater Toronto area recently. And so police across the region have stressed that they're trying to keep up with the volume of attacks that's gone from just a handful a few years ago to literally hundreds. And they're often connected to other crimes, including, other drug-related crimes and other types of violent crimes for that matter as well. So, these are important issues that we have to consider when we're talking about the nature of law enforcement as well. And that's why we do see different responses to crimes that are committed. We see people treated differently if they are, engaging in a fight, a dispute over money or something like that, or a couple of friends, versus if one is, robbing a random person on the street. Again, I'm not here to make my own moral judgment in that regard. I'm just here to suggest that there are these different kinds of violence then. And even though I've made this distinction here between moralistic and predatory violence, I also want to note, too, that in some real-life situations, the two can be conflated, or at least there can be some overlap, if you will. So you can imagine, for example, a robbery that's meant, to be purely predatory in nature. They just want to take your money, or whatever. But then, what if the victim fights back and they curse and they, say disrespectful things back to the, or they challenge the aggressor in some way or another. And then that leads to maybe further violence and victimization that's more moralistic in nature. Okay, and then finally, there are two other types of violence you may not have considered. Black has discussed these as well in his earlier work. So in some cases, then, people engage in what's called recreational violence, or violence purely in the pursuit of fun or entertainment or excitement or amusement. And this type of violence would include everything from fight clubs, and you'll recall the first rule of Fight Club, right? You do not talk about Fight Club. But this, different sports, to playful wrestling amongst friends, that sort of thing. In fact, in high school, my core group of friends and we used to play a stupid game where we would punch each other and sort of track the punches, or how often we punched one another, using a kind of a calibrated scale. So for example, if you punched somebody in the arm, that was the definition of 1. You owed somebody 1. If they punched you, you owed them 1. If you punched somebody on the forearm, then that was worth 20 standard punches. I think a punch right here in the shoulder was worth 5. Punch to the face was worth 45, and so on. So again, we had this whole system, if you will, and so and you were there for, and it was just purely for fun. This wasn't done out of menace, or we weren't angry with each other. It was just our way of playing a stupid game. In fact, for a couple of years, we also played something called the ring game, where we'd spin this class ring on a piece of paper that had different numbers and so forth. And whatever the number it landed on, 3, 7, 5, whatever it could be, that's the number of punches you got to give the other person next to you. And then we'd go around and everybody would spin the ring and you'd punch the person next to you. Again, obviously, typically you're hoping that it'd be a small number when it was your turn to be punched. But, you never know. Okay, and finally then there's ritualistic violence, which essentially refers to any violence that's used in the context of conducting socially approved of rituals. I actually call this normative violence, like it's normatively sanctioned. It's appropriate. It's considered to be okay, at least by the people who are engaged in it, right? Or they've consented to it and so forth, like hazing practices in fraternities, hazing rituals, that sort of thing. But then there's also even things that are a little bit more controversial, right? That are practiced in certain cultures, like genital mutilation, involving, for example, newborn females, or even circumcision amongst newborn males. And then, of course, perhaps most dramatically, you've got instances of human sacrifices. So, again, what I'm arguing then is that there isn't just one type of violence, but rather that there are many different types of violence, just as there are many different types of crime. Okay, so why does that matter? Who cares? Well, there's 2 reasons. First, the justifications as to the appropriateness or inappropriateness varies with the type of violence in question. So, for example, if people engage in moralistic violence, typically they think they're in the right. They think they are justified in using violence, again, to right or wrong, or to protect themselves, or to manage a conflict of some kind. And again, perhaps the most widespread example of this, or the use of moralistic violence, is something I talked about earlier. That is the use of corporal punishment with one's children, spanking and that sort of thing. Parents and even teachers in many contexts will justify their use of corporal punishment as a necessary or appropriate response with younger children to correct their behavior, or at least under certain circumstances, as a form of punishment. And yet, in contrast, almost no one condones predatory violence. Most of our laws and international agreements, in fact, are designed to prohibit such behavior. Of course, we still witness a ton of this type of violence, but again, that's why we have court systems and trials and prisons and so on. And then the second key point about this is that it's crucial to recognize that if there are different types of violence, then logically, there are going to be different types of explanations. In effect, while it's fine to ask, why are people violent? It's even better, and I would argue more helpful, to ask, why do some people engage in predatory violence, for example, while most people do not? What explains predatory violence? Or we might also ask, under what conditions are individuals or groups more likely to engage in moralistic violence? Or why do people sometimes engage in recreational violence? And so on. So I think we're better off than developing explanations that are tailored to the different kinds of violence. You see my point? So stated another way, I'm not confident that there can or should be one unitary or unified theory of violence. I think we're better off developing different explanations that account for different types of violence. There may be some common mechanisms involved, but I think that because of the differences in the types of violence and the social context in which the different types of violence emerge, we have to go beyond violence as a universal and look at how and why and when and where are we more likely to find or observe instances of different kinds of violence. And in fact, we're actually pretty good at that. We have a pretty good understanding. And again, even more so when we break down violence into the different categories, the different types. And so that's what I'll be tackling to some degree in future vlogs as well, explaining the different types of violence that we see in the world today. Okay, but for now, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, not violence, nurture love in your hearts, and remember, arms are for hugging, not for hitting. Hope to see you soon.